Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
We, each of us, have the opportunity, if we want to create an emotional experience. We get that luxury and that control based on how we think about things. So ultimately, whilst we're doing our level best to influence the listener, it'll be the listener who gets the ultimate control over the experience they get based on how they think about this show and how it's working for them.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe and let's meet today's guest.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Sykes. I'm the author of the book Sales Glue. I'm the host of the podcast Salescadence, and I run a sales training company. You can find me at www.salescadence.co.uk.
On this episode with the legend that is Matt, and I really enjoyed recording this episode. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss and one of the biggest bang for topics I think there is for B2B salespeople. We're diving into mindset, attitude, essentially how what we think, what it changes in what we feel, and then how it changes with this process of kind of adding a bit on the end, how we perform each day, essentially what we do. And so with that, let's jump right into the show. Is the psychology of the inner game, is that somewhat misunderstood, or is that kind of interpreted? Is it not put into practice as much as what it should be? Versus, I feel like we spend a lot of time thinking about the outer game, how to send cold emails, how to do strategy and tactics. Is there a discrepancy between how much time we spend on the outer game typically versus the inner game?
There's probably a discrepancy. Obviously, I can't speak for everybody, but if I think about my own situation, Will, for sure, certainly in the past, a clear discrepancy, more focus on what was going on out there and probably less going on what was going on in here. I think we're all bombarded, aren't we, with this understanding and awareness that mindset and attitude has got to have some kind of play in the work that we do in B2B selling, for sure. I think if you asked any sales director, how important is it for the mindset and attitude of your team to be right up there and off the charts, I think every single one of them would say, well, without a shadow of a doubt, Matt, it has to be. I think if you then follow that up, Will, with a question, which is, okay, what are you doing to train your team on that particular skill then? I think at that point, we then start to scratch our heads a little bit. And so in answer to your question, I think there's a lot of information out there. But I believe that perhaps what we could do if we had the opportunity, and maybe this is a great opportunity, if we could understand a little bit more about how mindset and attitude can actually be used, rather than those sort of, I don't know what you're like when you see those posts on Instagram about, motivation stuff, and which has all got its place, don't get me wrong, but how do I take what I see on Instagram, which is effectively a good news story message to me, and turn that into real quality, revenue building B2B activity? And that's where I think this inner game of mindset can link very nicely to the outer game of actually what we do.
What is the difference between, and you use those words seemingly specifically, Matt, or what's the difference, if there's any, between your mindset and then your attitude?
I think the two are linked. I think the words mindset and attitude are banded about all over the place, Will. I think attitude and mindset are linked. And the reason I say that is because I genuinely believe that the two mean the same thing. Let's just explore it if we can for a second. If we are prepared to accept the fundamental principles of basic psychology, you, sir, are an expert in science. You've got another podcast. And so I've got to be really careful here because I'm not a psychologist. I don't claim to be one. I wouldn't want to be one. I'm really comfortable being a sales professional. But if I was to dip into the world of performance psychology, which is an area that I've spent probably 10 years studying now, the last 5 years professionally training that subject matter, I spend my time helping sales professionals in the B2B space perform at their mental best. So I have a real acute understanding of the fundamental principles of psychology. And if we sort of have a quick look at that, Will, what do we know from psychology? We know that ultimately, despite the fact it's quite a technical subject, what it's really asking us to explore is how we think about stuff. And now we think about stuff all the time. In some cases, I've read research where we could spend 50, 60, 70,000 thoughts in any one day thinking about stuff. And on that point as well, we'll think about the fact that I guess you and I are exactly the same as all of your listeners. At some point in our lifetime, we'll have had a dream, a nightmare, something like that. And what that creates for us, well, is the evidence to know that this thing called mind is clicking over even when we're asleep. And sometimes people will refer that to as subconscious thought. But we think about stuff all the time. Now, if what we're doing is thinking about stuff all of the time, is there an opportunity then for us to start to think in certain ways? And if we think in certain ways, our mindset, our attitude towards something, so our attitude towards a buyer, our attitude towards sales rejection, our attitude to how many cold calls I'm going to make today. If we're able to shape our thoughts, and I'd like to sort of share with you a way in which you can in a second, we can probably have two different outcomes. If we think about those activities in one way, we might have a kind of a unhelpful, destructive outcome as a result of that. If we decide to focus in a slightly different way, in a more constructive way, then we probably will start to see a different kind of activity or a different kind of behavior. So I don't know if that answers the question correctly about mindset and attitude, but for me, they're linked.
Okay, so we've talked about this on the show. I actually had I think he was from Stanford, a Stanford kind of PhD, to talk about people's mindsets on being an optimist and pessimist. It's relatively well studied. Optimists will take more risks, will fail more often, but typically end up better off than a pessimist who will take less risks, will have less downside, but will stay relatively flat across a corporate career, not necessarily sales, but kind of going up the corporate ladder into management, senior management, that kind of thing. So what we're saying here isn't just kind of words and Instagram quotes and fluff and nonsense like that. This is relative. Certain angles of it are relatively well studied. So with that said, getting more granular than just being an optimist or a pessimist, because I think you're going to really struggle to cold call people being a pessimist, right? Assuming that we want to be an optimist, what else or what other traits or attitudes or elements of mindset do top sales performers have that perhaps average middle people who want to improve themselves can try and instill into their own game?
Well, let me link back to one of your podcasts that I listened to recently, where the subject matter on that was very similar to the conversation we're having right now. But one of the really valuable takeaways that I took from it was the fact that in this particular case, the nature of the conversation that your guest was having with you is about the fact that behavior happens before mindset and attitude. Now, I fundamentally agree with that, Will, but I want to explore, if I can, what happens if we put attitude in front of behavior, which is, the point I was trying to allude to a second ago. Because if we're willing to accept basic fundamental psychology that we think all the time, if I was to say to you right now, if you're on, let's put it out to the listener. We've got a listener at the moment who's thinking to themselves, "My God, this is rubbish. What on earth has Will done inviting this guy onto the show?" Now, we could describe those as kind of destructive thoughts that person's currently having. They're not happy. Basic psychology tells us that the way that we think is having a big impact on how we feel. It's creating an emotional state. So there's someone in the car right now or on the treadmill and they're listening to this and they're thinking to themselves, what a waste of time. Will's made a real mistake here. This guy, Matt, doesn't know what he's talking about. If we accept that thoughts create emotional intensity, Will, you tell me the sorts of feelings that person on that treadmill will be having if they're having those kind of thoughts.
If they're having those thoughts, they're going to be feeling miserable, uptight, kind of just angry. I don't know.
Yeah, they could be pissed off. They could be really, really frustrated by the fact that they're sort of wasting their time. But let's flip it. Let's test it in a different way. If we're accepting the fact that the way that we think creates our emotional intensity, if that person is thinking to themselves something completely different, and I'm going to call these constructive thoughts, and they're thinking to themselves, B2B salesman show, awesome. I love it. Everything that Will puts out is great stuff. This guy seems to know what he's talking about. There's some real value and interest in this for me. If someone's thinking like that in a more constructive way, then we're going to get a completely different set of feelings, aren't we? They're going to be thinking to themselves. They're going to be feeling engaged. They're going to be feeling potentially inspired. They're going to be feeling motivated to want to hear more. Okay? Now, here's a big important question for your listener. Despite the fact that the words that you and I are sharing together are exactly the same, no different to all of your hundreds of thousands of listeners, do we believe or do we think that every single one of those hundreds of thousands of listeners are going to take away the same message from this session?
No.
And the question of that has to be answered with no. And the reason we say no, Will, would be what?
The reason, because they have their own world, environment, and things being thrown at them. And so they're only going to be open to hearing certain things.
Correct. We're all completely different and we all think differently, despite the fact my wife thinks she thinks for me, she doesn't. I think for myself. Because we all think for ourselves and we'll all take away something different from this podcast, who ultimately then do you think is responsible for the experience while they listen to this podcast? You and me in our conversation or them as the listener?
So them as the listener, but is it? We might go way too deep, and you can pull us back out in a second, Matt. But from what I'm getting at here, it's almost like if the environment and our stimulus and all these things, and we know this as a phenomenon of you're miserable, you put on some awesome music, you dance around with headphones on, and hopefully no one sees you, and then you get happy, so you can manipulate your thoughts, feelings, and emotions via kind of external things. Well, is that not just saying then that our voice, the thing that we feel as kind of thoughts and feelings, is just a commentary on the physical world around us?
What it's saying really well is that we, each of us, have the opportunity, if we want to create an emotional experience. We get that luxury and that control based on how we think about things. So ultimately, whilst we're doing our level best to influence the listener, it'll be the listener who gets the ultimate control over the experience they get based on how they think about this show and how it's working for them. And that's a really important point, which we might, if we get a chance, hook back to in a second. But if we just carry this very briefly, just carry this sort of circle thing going round, the way that we think creates how we feel, but it's the way that we feel that impacts what we do. So again, if I go back to the listener who's on the treadmill and they're frustrated because they're not getting anything out of the show, the chances are they might even switch off. They might even unsubscribe, God forbid, I'm sure they won't, but they might decide, the mindset stuff's not for me. So their behavior will be driven by their thought and their feeling. But again, if we flip it over and there's someone who's thinking to themselves, this is okay, I'm getting some value out of this, I'm feeling quite motivated to listen more, totally different set of behaviors. Would you agree?
Yeah. So
they
is what we say, Matt, that just to put this in a kind of a straightforward order, what we think leads to how we feel, which then goes straight into how we physically do things.
Absolutely right. And then if I link that message, Will, back to the previous show where, and again, I'm not disagreeing, I'm just bringing a different perspective to the audience, where behavior drives attitude. What we could agree, actually, it's the other way around. That our behavior is driven by how we feel about a situation, and how we feel about a situation is fundamentally impacted by how we think. So, because the challenge sometimes with, behaving before realizing why I want to behave is pretty catastrophic. Because, think of the B2B massive out there that are told to do some brilliant sales skill, and they execute that brilliant sales skill called behavior. And let's just say, for argument's sake, they get a no. Unless they've got the ability or the persistence to go and try it again and again and again, and that ultimately will come from mindset, because rejection is a cruel thing. We experience a lot more no's in this industry than we get yeses. If you're not willing to understand that to continue to try it again is the right thing to do, to accept that failure is part of the process and all those wonderful buzzwords that we do hear on Instagram or see on Instagram, then potentially people can stop too soon. And for me, what creates then the point was made brilliantly by your previous guest, that behavior then does drive attitude, is true in so much as long as I do the right things, and even when it fails, as long as it's right, I keep doing more of it, what I then start to create for myself is results. Because if you think back to you 4.5, 5 years ago, before you started this wonderful podcast, you didn't have one. Okay. Fast forward now 4.5 years time, you've got almost 600 episodes. So actually what you're looking at there, when you look down that catalog of seasons, is evidence, and it's the evidence that drives you forward. We need these kind of low-hanging fruit around us to say, do you know what, I'm doing okay. I'm getting results. I'm picking the phone up, I'm dialing, I'm getting through to the right person. I'm asking the right questions. I'm doing the right levels of qualification. I'm handling that objection. I'm getting a sale, and then I feel great about that. So I totally see that how behavior then creates a mindset once you're running. I think you've got to start putting the thought process in front of the behavior to get the thing running in the first place.
So if we're going to focus on now what we need to think, I guess two questions. One, what do top sales professionals or high performers in general think that non-high performers don't, which then leads to their feelings, emotions, and then how they take action? So that's kind of what do high performers think? And then also, do they think in principles, or do they think wishy-washy kind of consciously on each specific decision, or do they have a kind of format that they go to every time?
Well, I tried the latter as an experiment and it didn't work. So I sort of realized early on in my sales career that, there had to be some structure and some process. The business that I run, Salescadence, we have, similar to maybe the others, at a sheer coincidence, I have three fundamental specialisms: mindset, ability, process. The mindset bit we talked about, and it needs to come first for me. The ability is the sales skill, And then the P is the process, which how do I keep that sales skill consistent? So if I was to answer your question about what are some of the skills that ultra high performing sales professionals have from a mindset perspective, the number one skill for me is understanding how you think. Because the challenge that we've got, of course, Will, and you'll know this from your science background, is that we have this inbuilt negativity bias. Yeah, thousands and thousands of years ago, we decided we were under attack from the dinosaurs, and we haven't really released that as human beings. So for all the right reasons, we stopped doing stupid stuff because our inbuilt negativity bias says, "Don't do that stupid thing, man." The problem with that, Will, is that if you aren't willing to accept that fact, and you aren't prepared to work at that, and this is a muscle like every other muscle in the body. If you're not willing to try and train that thing, then the challenge then is your default position becomes a negative one. And there's plenty of books out there like The Chimp Paradox, Steve Peters, where that inner chimp takes control of that situation and goes, "Oh, that was rejection. That was rejection. That buyer said, no, you don't want to be going anywhere near that again." So one of the key things I think for ultra high performing sales professionals is accepting that they've got a piece of kit up here that can work against them, and understanding what they can do to ensure that it works for them. I think the second thing that they do is then they realize to themselves, well, hang on a second then, if I've got one that works like that, there's just the chance that the person across the table or on the end of the phone has got one of those too. And if I go back to the sort of that circle we were creating for ourselves, which is thoughts create emotions or feelings, that can be exactly the same across the table. So I can now start to trigger the buyer's negativity bias. And if you think about the classic questions that you and I are very familiar with, once we've gone through those fact-based questions at the start of a sales discussion to make sure they've got budget and authority and timeline, very quickly we move into that process of uncovering the problem. And let's be honest about it, we make it pretty uncomfortable for people. And we do that to trigger the negativity bias, but we do that because we want their commitment to make change and move. Because if we can't make it uncomfortable, there's just a chance they might decide to default back. So I think the second thing then is recognizing that the other person has got the same kind of mindset triggers as we have. And I guess the third one, the big one for me, is persistence. Because, here you are 600 episodes in, something's happened to your psychology, Will, that's allowed you to say after episode number 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to keep going. I don't know if I just released season 1 of my podcast. I look back at my first 1 or 2 recordings and I was really wooden. But you learn over time because you're in this new territory, aren't you? But what you're doing is you're uncovering this latent potential, and it's saying, go on, have another go then. Try again. See what you think. I listen to your podcast now. They're the best out there. And I'm not just saying that because we're looking at each other now. You learn, don't you? But you learn, don't you? You learn to improve, you tweak, and you become better as a result of that mindset skill, which is persistence.
So we know persistence is important in pretty much any area of life, and just the ability to, especially if you're new to sales and you're cold calling, or for me, I've never really had to cold call in the past in different sales roles. When I'm selling the advertising space on the podcast, it's typically a somewhat warm email because most of the brands I work with at least have heard of the show or they recognize the brand and that side of things. So even if they tell me to, go kick rocks, it's a polite email that they send because they might want to work with us in the future. So if even the point of that tale was that if I was to start cold calling, I would have to get over this. And essentially there's a hump, right, that you've got to get over before it gets easier. What can we do to make the psychology of getting over that hump, the psychology of instilling persistence, and how do we make that easier? Because this is something that I struggle with. The podcast is the only thing I've ever done for more than 2 years. Every sales job I've ever had has been kind of 2 or 3 years long. And this is the only thing I've ever done really for longer than that. So I'm struggling from this myself.
Let's go back to that thoughts create emotions thing, Will, for a second, because why won't someone want to come into work and face a day where they've got to make 50 or 100 cold calls? Irrespective if we agree that cold calling is the right thing to do or the wrong thing, let's use that as the example. There's a reason why some people will struggle with cold calling. And probably the main one will be that the behavior is fundamentally flawed. And this is where, sales training can help the individual. Asking the right questions. First of all, making sure you're speaking to the right person, doing some social engineering and some information finding before you pick the phone up so you've got something to talk about. All the stuff that all of your guests have shared in the past. And so that will really, really help us. But that's not mindset. But what that does for your mindset, it says, okay, I am so prepared now that when I pick this phone up, at least At the very least, I know what I'm talking about. At the very least, I've kind of worked out what I think they might say back to me. And at the very least, I've got an answer for that. That can work. But just imagine what you could do if you added to that situation, Will, the fact that you have this massive piece of kit up here that at the moment is being, should we say, underutilized. If we go back to the circle, the way that we think creates our emotional intensity. So if rejection is an emotion, where does that emotion ultimately come from? The person on the end of the phone, or my interpretation by the way that I think about what they just said?
It's your interpretation in that.
Absolutely.
And maybe this is brilliant, 'cause maybe this is a separator between someone who is good and poor. A good person ignores the potential of rejection, carries on going for another few seconds, and then the call gets to a place where it's just a normal conversation, right? Whereas someone who immediately goes, "Oh, I've been rejected," hangs up and then tries again, or maybe doesn't try again.
Yeah. So ultimately, we could, if I use Uncle G, Grant Cardone's classic statement, rejection's a myth. It is a myth, because the only way I can feel rejected, if I buy into the fundamental principles of basic psychology that says the way that I feel is driven directly from how I think, and only I think for myself, then I am responsible for how I feel. Therefore, I'm the one that's responsible for the sales rejection. And as long as I bring these two, and this is the importance of mindset and attitude coming together. I totally agree with previous guests on the show that if you pluck someone off the street and they had a really positive psychology but didn't know how to sell, there would always be some challenge for obvious sake. It would take you a number of weeks and months to get them up to a position where they could go and do some work for you. So you do need the two, but when you bring those two together, then you've got some, I'll use your words, Will, then you've got ultra high performance potential. So recognizing that when I go on the call and if I do all the behavioral work and I've got myself set up is one thing, but knowing that whatever comes down the end of the phone, I control, I own the reaction, puts you in a completely different state of mind. And I genuinely believe what we start to meander into then are things like emotional intelligence, emotional resilience, well-being in the office environment. Imagine if you had an office full of people on the phones all day long who were completely resilient to rejection. What impact could that have on the bottom line performance of that team of people?
How do we stop it on environment for a second? And then I've got a kind of slightly on topic, but sidetracked anecdote, which I'll share, or something I'm personally working on as we record this kind of at the beginning of the year, something I'm working on for this year. I'll share that in a second. But with regards to environment, what can we do if, I guess there's two kind of layers to this. One, if we're in an office space, there's a bunch of miserable people around us. There's the obvious one of not complaining, not gossiping, avoiding individuals who are kind of pessimist and negative in the office. But is there anything we can do in the office environment to improve our kind of mental game? And then I guess the same question as a follow-up after that of what can we do if we're driving around in a car all day and we're in kind of field sales?
I think you touched on a couple of really important points. I think surrounding yourself with the right people is key, without a shadow of a doubt. And if you have an opportunity to try and influence that in some way, shape, or form, and I appreciate that that's not always realistic, because if you're working for a boss, then to some extent her or his rules apply. But having the opportunity to hang around with the right kind of people helps. But if I was to give you a practical method that would help improve, your emotional resilience, your mindset, I'll use the example I used a little while ago. 600 episodes of the Salesman Podcast is evidence of good quality work. Okay, I've heard on previous podcasts as a listener, Will, that you do journaling. Yeah, you take gratitude as a key point of advantage, and I agree with that. But if I look at journaling, journaling is really, really important as well, because what journaling allows us to do is to capture stuff. So, a lot of the clients that I work with, we will advocate highly the importance of capturing the evidence, because, if you have a great day in the office and then you go home and then you come back to work the following day, yesterday's day is gone, but yesterday may have included a whole bunch of really good stuff. So just capturing that evidence, the achievement, and having it in a journal. Just imagine if you then spent let's say you spent 2019 saying, all right, I'll take Matt's advice. Every day when I finish work, I'll go home and I'll stick in that journal just one thing, one sense of achievement, one thing I did really, really well. and write it down. It might be a deal you did. It might have been staying in a very particularly long, drawn out, complex sale. It could have been, making 10% more cold calls than you were asked to do. It could be all of these wonderful things that you and I and all of the guys and girls listening do on a daily basis, but kind of take for granted. Capture it would be my advice, because when you've got a year's worth of 365 brilliant pieces of evidence, not only do you learn back what you've learned, you prove to yourself on a daily basis that actually I'm achieving. And that sense of achievement, and I'll go back to that previous podcast, that's where behavior really leads to improving mindset. If I can see it in the book and I did it and I can remember it, I feel great about that. And if I feel great about that, I'll go and do another one.
So it's funny you should say this, because I'm right in the midst of it with our kind of two programmers at the moment. So the sales school is getting an overhaul. It won't be done by the time this show comes out, but it'll be done by kind of Q2, Q3 of this year. And one of the things that I'm doing is very literally what you're describing. So there'll be kind of two tiers. One tier, you'll get a beautiful journal. And one of the things in it is kind of the front end of the day is to sort out what your most important task is of the day. If you could do one thing that would make all the rest of the stuff redundant all day, what's that one thing, and can you get it done in 24 hours? The end of the journal is what's one win. Even if you've had the shittiest day of all time, there's typically something that perhaps you had to leave work early because you go into your daughter's ballet recital or whatever it is. You don't have to be selling. Did you manage to achieve that? Did you have if you can take a few hours off work to do that, it means you're somewhat financially secure, and there's all the gratitude that trickles down alongside that. Well, we're doing that alongside a kind of software which tracks all this. It tracks your, not just necessarily how many calls you make and things like that, which it does touch on, but it also tracks your energy levels of the day and your happiness of the day. And what I'm hoping, and this is somewhat of an experiment and it might end up being complete nonsense and bullshit, what I'm hoping is that people will see this calendar of, I was low energy this day, I only did 14 calls, and I wasn't really all that happy. Then the next 3 or 4 days, I was super high energy, I was happy, I made more calls, I had more success. On Friday, I didn't do anything because I'm lazy and I don't do nothing on a Friday. When you extrapolate that over 1 month, 2 months, you start to go, oh, Friday's 20% of the work week. I could probably earn 20% more if I just put a bit more effort in on a Friday. Maybe on a Friday, I'm actually really happy and I'm loads of energy because it's nearly the weekend and I'm going doing something incredible Saturday morning, but I just slack off and I don't do the work when that could be my best selling time. So we're kind of pulling all this together and amalgamating all this together, and hopefully there'll be some kind of data that we can publish and depending on how many people are in the sales school, this kind of time next year and the year after. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to report somewhat accurately that, happy salespeople are more successful salespeople. Happy salespeople have more energy, or people who have bigger sales targets perhaps do less phone calls or less emails or whatever it is. Pull all these insights out. You know what, Will?
I absolutely 100% agree with you. It sounds like an awesome initiative, and I really look forward to seeing that, because for me, when you were talking there, what I took away there were two things. I think the first thing I would say is stuff happens, yeah? That life happens. We're always going to have these sorts of peaks and troughs. And accepting that is the case and being okay with it is kind of sort of nirvana for me, because I spent wasted too much time in my past beating myself up when things didn't go well. I accept the fact now. I try and change and improve, but I accept the fact that things aren't going to go well. So the first thing for me is, let's cut ourselves some slack, and let's try and be a 70 or an 80% rather than striving for the happy clappy Instagram nonsense of 100% with my Lamborghini. I'll get there eventually, but let's be realistic. But the second thing, I think the most important thing for me over what you just shared there with the audience, was there has to be some science. There has to be some data. There has to be a process, because if I can't go back and see why I peaked or why I dipped, how the hell can I change it? And that's a really fundamental thing about, certainly how I work with my clients, and clearly what you're going to be doing as well, is if I can see it, I can understand it. If I can understand it, I can change it if I want to. And I think then you give yourself an even greater chance.
And part of it as well, and I'm sure you'll be aware of this, whether you know the names of it and how it's described or not, but the kind of slang for it is the Seinfeld effect. So Seinfeld writes a new joke every single day and has done for decades. He has a big calendar on his wall, and every day he puts a big cross on it. Now, with a decade worth of crosses on calendars, I assume he changes it every year, otherwise he's going to just have one massive room with it going all the way around. When you get enough crosses on the wall of daily activity, you don't want to stop, right? So that's what we're trying to develop with the visual element of this as well of, oh, I've had a really productive day. I've had a really productive day. I've had a really productive day. Oh, I might slack off today. And then the software, if you do slack off, is going to give you a kick in the ass. It's going to kind of give you a note that, oh, you were on a 15-day workday streak of really hustling, and you wanted to take a day off because you had pizza last night and you feel a bit bleh. Well, for a day, most people can push themselves through a little bit of that. Or again, you find out that every time you have pizza, you have 3 days off of not really doing anything. Turns out you're allergic to dairy, which was kind of my tale, which I think I've told on the podcast before. So pizza's my favorite food. We literally go to Chicago every couple of years to see family and have pizza. That is like the second part of the holiday over there, to go and get some amazing deep pan pizza. And we go to Rome, Italy as well and get pizza there. My last holiday in Rome, I had pizza every single night. Now, with that said, I found myself getting more and more sluggish every time I ate like obviously I was eating too much pizza. I wouldn't just be having one slice. So that's part of the tale as well. And I told my dad this, and he turns around to me and goes, do you know what? So that sounds familiar. I'm like, what do you mean it sounds familiar? It's like, well, we couldn't give you cow's milk as a child. We had to give you some like kind of non-cow milk formula because you had a ratch every time we give it. I was like, why didn't you tell me this 31 years ago? And it could have changed my performance this whole time, because I will literally have a pizza and then 2 days later be sluggish. Long story short, you don't need software to do this. You can do this on a piece of paper and track it yourself. But I feel like tracking things that we're doing every single day is incredibly important, right?
Well, great point. Let's link back to mindset again, because here's another interesting tip that I think is useful. We all use lists. Will, your last point. We've all got to-do lists. Why don't we start to write a different list? What about a what and why list? So what am I going to do today, and why am I going to do it? Because I don't know about you, but in my previous corporate life, I did a lot of stuff that I think to myself, what's the point of this? And okay, a lot of it is driven by the man or the lady who's in charge, but ultimately, I'm doing stuff. You and I now, we work in a world called self-employment, work for ourselves, and we are both ruthless with our time. Okay, I no longer do the rubbish. Okay, I've earned the right to do that because I don't work for anybody else. I work for myself, but I am hypercritical with how I spend my time. Why on earth wouldn't anybody be the same as me? So even those people that are, in a terrific salary job in the B2B world, who've got a ton of stuff going on, my advice to all those people is start to measure, not manage, measure your time. Get really, really conscious of the stuff that you do that brings cash. I call that the revenue, or the day job, as I sometimes refer to it. And if my to-do list has got more than 70 or 80% of pound notes or dollar signs next to it, because that's the indication for me that piece of activity is going to lead to generating an invoice or an order, I'm happy. If I run that list and I don't see enough dollar signs or pound signs, that's a big warning to me that says, Matt, you can do this hobby stuff as long as you want, buddy, but you won't be in business next year. And it's the same in the B2B environment. So, how many of your listeners could really think themselves, you know what, maybe I get a bit more ruthless in my time. Maybe I'll start to make my list slightly differently. Why am I doing this? What's in it for me? Because we are, whether we like it or not, again, back to basic psychology, Will, all self-satisfying. Everything that we do, whether we think we aren't or we are, we do because we want to do it. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it, would we? Let's be honest about it. And most people might be listening and think, well, hang on a second, Matt. I'm not sure I agree with you, because I get told to do a lot of stuff. And I agree with you, the fact that you get told to do your stuff, but ultimately the reason why you do it is your choice and not theirs, because no one thinks for you. No one makes you go to work. You decide to do it. And I think if you can pull that into your kind of psychological armory or your arsenal, recognize the fact that you've got a ton of accountability. That responsibility is your gift. You decide what you do on a daily basis, not other people. And if you're willing to accept that the job you're in right now, or the customer you're driving to go and see, who might be a bit difficult, if you're willing to accept it's your choice to go there, otherwise you wouldn't go, I think you take a completely different person with you. You take somebody who's full of good grace, full of a very constructive psychology, and we know what thinking in a certain direction can create, the sorts of emotions that drive constructive, helpful behavior, and it's that behavior that gets you the result.
I know, I agree with everything you're saying, and I know anecdotally that when I go to see, or when I used to go and see a surgeon who'd be, renowned for being a complete pain in the ass, and some of them were, on their own high horse, and everyone's sucked up to them all the time. I know it was a totally different dynamic when I was willing to walk into that room, that kind of operating theatre, be like kind of semi-scrubbed up, stood there talking to them in my scrubs, And I was always willing to just go, okay, see ya. I'm off from here if you're going to try and bully me. And I'd see them bullying other reps. And this is more, there was a level of perhaps of arrogance, especially when I first got into sales, that led me to this conclusion as opposed to being enlightened and understanding any of the psychology behind it. But I was always happy just to walk out the room. I guess it's a standard, right? I wasn't going to let anyone talk down to me when I knew I could just leave. And I always had the optimistic mindset that I could just find another customer. It doesn't matter who they are. That may or may not have been the case, because clearly some of these surgeons were on their high horse because they spent so much money and they knew that they could twist people's arms to get what they wanted from suppliers and vendors. But I was too dumb to realize any of that. Now, that changed the dynamics of the conversation then, because it raises me up. So they see me not as a peer perhaps, but they see me as someone who is probably got a ton of value to offer and so doesn't have to put up with nonsense, versus someone who doesn't have a lot to offer, doesn't have a lot of value to give, is going to take it all because they're going to take whatever they can get. And I always found that when sales managers came out with me, they always commented, or sales trainers, whoever it was, they always commented that I had a kind of a matey relationship with the surgeons and different people in the organisation here in the NHS in the UK, procurement teams that were renowned for being arseholes to other people. And I narrow it down to kind of that, just to add an anecdotal spin onto what you were saying there.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the wonderful people at Sandler, one of the things that they share is having that mindset to go into a room as if you don't need the sale. And they sometimes refer to it as having a billionaire mindset. If you're in front of that person who's difficult at giving you a hard time, and you had $1 billion in the bank, would you give a shit? Would you care? And I'm kind of okay with that. But what I'm fearful of is making sure that people have the right knowledge to know how to go into that room. And the way that you help, build on that brilliant mindset that Sandler talk about there is you pull in, some of the tricks of the trade, for want of a better expression, which is, okay, I have this thing up here. One of the things I know it does for me is it visualizes. I can think about stuff without, even thinking about it. You'll have heard many, many times, the difference between the conscious and the subconscious mind. We can drive a car, we can arrive at the destination and forget what the last 25 minutes was all about because I'm thinking about the meeting I'm going to. We drive the car subconsciously on autopilot, but we're there thinking of something different. We talked earlier about the fact we can have a dream or a nightmare. So we know that we can create these images in our mind. Well, when you go into that room with that billionaire mindset, you create that for yourself because you visualize what's about to happen in advance. Yeah. And it might sound a bit weird sitting in a car park 5 minutes before you're going into a meeting, but as long as you've done your prep, as long as you've got in front of you all of the right behavior tricks and tips that you've been taught by a good quality sales trainer, all the questions, what objections might come, how to turn those objections round, and how to close a sale and even possibly seek for a referral. If you've got all of that nailed down and you've got some great points to talk about them to understand what their problem is and find a way to bridge your solution to that problem, you've got total confidence of where you're going to go. If all you then do is put yourself in the future for 10 minutes and say, right, when I go into that room, this is how it's going to go. Okay, I am well prepared. I'm feeling confident about that. I've pretty much worked out, because I've met this person before, what their psychology is. I now know the things that they don't want to hear. I know the things that they do want to hear. I'm going in there with some value because I know they've got a problem. And guess what? They know that as well. And they probably need me as much as I need them. A lot of the challenges, I guess, the sales population struggle with sometimes is this importance of parity. Knowing that when I go in that room, Peter Thompson, and if you've never had him on the podcast, he's someone that you should go and search out. Peter Thompson taught me once, every sales professional wants to be just south of arrogance. You don't actively go out there to be arrogant. You just drop below it and, just create that presence and that aura which says, I'm here to do a job. I'm a sales professional. I'm here to make my company money and I'll make you some money too. Let's have that conversation. When you visualize how that meeting is going to go, and you can clearly do that because we all know how to visualize, you give yourself an even greater chance. Because you might also want to visualize, well, what happens if it goes wrong? What happens if they do say that? What happens if they say no? But because you planned and because you visualize what might happen, you create, I think, even more advantage. Because, back to basic psychology, Will, if we think about stuff, the classic reticular activating system, all that kind of brilliant stuff, if we think about stuff on a regular basis, what we're actually doing is we're traveling the neural pathways of our brain. And the more we travel them, the more they get wider. The more they get wider, the easier it is for us to slip into them. It's no surprise to me that professional sports athletes visualize on a daily basis. They do that to gain sports advantage. And unfortunately now we're starting to see that that 25-year-old skill of performance psychology now creeping its way into the sales world.
I was just going to touch and kind of wrap up your point there on that, Matt, of if this sounds somewhat wishy-washy, yeah, psychology, mindset, visualization, especially because that was done to death, 10 years ago, 20 years ago in self-help books. You've only got to look at Olympic athletes or professional footballers or whatever the sport is or high performer is. I bet if you ask Elon Musk, if you ask any of these high-performing individuals that are perhaps going into sell a business, buy a business, negotiate, whatever it is, and they're playing at a high, a table of perhaps higher stakes than what some of us mere mortals might do, or are doing right now if you're listening to this show as a B2B sales professional. I guarantee they're visualizing as well, right? And I just feel like from that we can infer how powerful and useful it is. Clearly there's data coming along that supports all this using functional MRI machines and scanning brains as people are visualizing and doing memory recall on physical things like playing piano. It's all being tested. But just the fact that someone who is in a high performance position that perhaps we would like to be in is doing it, that's a good indication of something that we should be trying to implement into our game, right?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. But we don't need to look too far, Will. I mean, every one of your hundreds of thousands of subscribers and listeners are visualizing in their job 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And I'll prove it to you. Because if they're a good quality sales professional, they're going out to identify an ideal customer profile that fits and works for them. They're having a conversation where they've identified somebody's got a problem and they're linking their solution to that problem. The key thing that all ultra high performing sales professionals do is they create impact. And they create impact with the classic, what happens if you don't question. Now, the only way the person across the table can solve that conundrum or that question is to visualize what might happen if they don't solve it. Yeah. The great sales professionals then, after a period of time, will then move them into a very positive mindset, which is, okay, I'm not sure I can help you, but let's just pretend I could. Let's just think forward 6 months' time. What's happening in your business as a result of solving this problem? How do they get there? They have to visualize. So I take your point that it's been done to death, but the great thing about the world of selling is it's been the same for 100 years. It'll be the same for the next 100 years. You can bring AI into the conversation all you like. As far as I'm concerned, if you're a good quality sales professional, you're willing to accept the fact you can create advantage and separate yourself from everybody else. And that 10% of the nation out there that do listen to your show, the people like you and I that think, do you know what? I've got a bit of latent potential. I don't know what it is, but I think I'm capable of more. And they listen to podcasts like this, or they read books, or they listen to audio. It's that 10% that ultimately will find the key to unlock how they improve and how they get more successful. So, selling for me is going to be the same in the next 100 years. You've got to find somebody with a problem and you've got to help them solve it. And the only way you're going to help them solve it is normally by saying to them, what happens if you don't? And what would you do if you did?
We're not going to have time to dive into it in huge detail now, but something that I'm focusing on this year, just because I mentioned it earlier on that I was going to derail the show with this. So we'll wrap up kind of with these thoughts, Matt. You give me your thoughts on whether this is a good strategy or not. Something that I'm constantly kind of thinking about, and if we take how we think, how we feel, how we do, and then it goes from do to think, being motivated on that front, and then we kind of layer on top of that. There's probably a cool diagram we could do with this if you haven't done it already, with your environment and other factors kind of surrounding it as well, and where you are, your finances and your actual fixed goals, or whether you are all these different layers. One thing that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment is to try and shortcut and hack this process is, when I'm 40, I want to be semi-retired. I either want the podcast, the sales school, just to be kind of a beast, a mammoth project itself with office, and I can visualize. I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but something I'm aiming for within the next couple of years is to have a couple of salespeople in an office space with me, selling the sales school to sales leaders, and then to document it all, almost like a real-life office TV show. And then these sales reps that will be working for me will also be kind of on-camera personalities as well. So clearly there's multiple elements to hiring these individuals. It's going to be incredibly difficult, and it'll take some of the pressure off me from doing the content, and it'll allow it to just grow organically from that point. So with all that said, for me to get to that, there's clearly a bunch of milestones of revenue for the business to have the sales school at a point where it can be sold on a corporate level rather than just to individuals of the podcast, because they're perhaps different customers, and there's different kind of branding and persona that needs to go into the product. So maybe it's another product. So there's clear milestones that need to go into place for all of this. So I was thinking to myself, well, I don't feel like I'm the person who could do X, Y, Z right now. I'm nervous of committing to a 5-year lease, for example. I'm nervous about, I've got a bunch of freelancers on board and it's an incredible team and we all work remotely, but I've not got a salaried employee. So there's a bunch of different hard things I've got to have to do, or hard benchmarks, or hard things I've got to pass. Not that it's difficult to do hard, as in like it's a fixed thing that I've got to get past to get to the next stage. And I've been pondering over this point of, well, could I shortcut the process by, rather than worrying about it and then doing it and using willpower and talking about some of the things that we've talked about today of changing my mindset, would it not be easier just to work out who the person at 40 is who's done all this and achieved it, and then work on becoming that person and skipping out all these learning points in the meantime, if that makes sense? This is something I've been really pondering over. Is that something that is doable? Is that if you can layer out your career, if you wanted to get to the C-suite, should you start dressing like someone who's in the C-suite? Should you start reading books that the C-suite reads and try? And is that a viable way of cutting out a whole bunch of the learning process on the psychology, on the mindset, on the confidence front, Matt?
Well, there's a bundle of questions in there, but you and I, and most of the listeners, I'm sure, will have heard the quote that success leaves clues. And so one of the smartest things I did in my business world a couple of years ago was go and hire a coach. Somebody who was in my industry, so in the sales training or business development industry, someone who was experienced enough to have done exactly what I was trying to do, so that at least I knew I could ask that question. How do I shortcut this? Now, I think we have to be careful. I don't know, because I've never been in a situation where I've shortcutted to success. Sadly, I make mistakes like everybody else. I've learned how to leverage that opportunity that comes with a mistake. But I make mistakes as everybody else does. But I think, if we could sort of pull some of those bits together with some quality answers, you can fast track to some extent by asking the advice of someone who's been there and done that, and say, what would you do if, how did it work for you? And if you find the right person, I think you give yourself a huge advantage. I also think it's dangerous to shortcut. I am where I am in life because I have learned the lessons and I have improved as a result of having the lesson. So I'm a big believer that it's okay to cock up every now and again. And I think you learn a lot more that way, because if it's painful, you'll say, I don't want to do that again. So I think, whilst I'm not suggesting that everyone should not shortcut, I think there's some danger if you do. But for me, I guess the most practical thing I would say is one of the things I learned a number of years ago, and it comes from the world of sort of manufacturing, where I used to sell packaging for a living. And I was a sales guy, obviously, but I was walking around the shop floor, and they're all doing these fantastic process things like root cause analysis and Six Sigma and all that great stuff. But what I learned there is this thing called capability, and there's a number of steps that you must go through to become capable. And if you become capable, then you own that thing that you're trying to be. So I think it's very straightforward, Will, to some extent. You ask yourself, why do I want to be that person that I'm describing in 10 years or 5 years' time? What's in it for me? And I think if you get the answer to that, why I want to, and it's a positive one, and the one that inspires and makes you feel engaged to move forward, you get the right to go to the second question. The second question is, what do I need to do? And then it's a very simple, generic design. Here's what I want to do. Here's what I want it to look like. If you're still feeling confident and you're on board, you go to the third thing. Okay, it's more granular. What have I got to do? Because if you're the same as me, you'll get really pissed off with these number of people keep telling me, what you've got to do. Okay, tell me how to do it. And so in a funny kind of way, the how is basically saying, here are the 3 or 4 steps that I must do in order to get that business. I've got to go and hire those 2 people. Yeah, I've got to create that environment where we can film on a daily basis. The fourth one then ultimately is what's going on in my business once I've achieved it. Because again, it's really important for us to see these key performance indicators, the clues that say I'm doing well, because we'll see plenty of clues that say I'm not doing well. They're sometimes called no's. So that would be the fourth thing. And then the fifth thing is, do I need to involve anybody else, or who else needs to be involved? So I think there's a number of things that we can do. And I sort of mentioned that to you because it's really important for me in the 35% of what I teach in my sales training, Will, is mindset based. But I recognize the fact there'll be some people who think it's just hogwash, and kumbaya. So I have to make sure that when I present that information to a client, they can see the logic. And those sort of 5 steps of capability allows you to see the logic that says, if I know what my why is, and I've got these other 4 steps, and I write them all down, what I've created for myself is a blueprint that gives me the chance of becoming successful.
I think that is similar to what I was trying to describe, but a much better way, an articulate way of describing it that I'll be stealing. I think what I was trying to ask.
Yours.
Yeah,
I seem to remember I might have stolen it from somebody else in the past, and if I have, I apologize. But you come in contact with so much stuff, don't you? But it's logic when you think of it. We need some help.
Yeah.
Write it down. Write it down.
Because what I was trying to ask, and you summed it up, and we'll wrap up with this, Matt. I was trying to ask, well, rather than most people go, I want this, and then they go, well, how do I get it? Whereas I've been having this thought process, and I've been reading things and kind of getting mentoring and different things with different people of, well, rather than saying I want this, it's, well, if you become the person who can earn that easily, then you'll just get it. If I want a Nissan GTR and I'm the person, I've got the skill set, I've got the capabilities to do all these 3, 4, 5 things that leads to being the person who owns a GTR, then you'll have the cash flow to buy one, if that makes sense. It's almost like it's not a shortcut in doing less things and failing less often. It's probably the opposite. It's probably failing faster and moving forward, because you've got an end goal to go to rather than more of a windy road. At least you're heading north, even if the road is windy, versus kind of going back on yourself. And I think that was a really interesting way of summing it up. Of if you want to be, if you want to be, say, I'm 32. If I want to be 40, and I need to suss out the capabilities that 40-year-old Will has that enables him to do everything that he wants to do, right? And then obviously this is all, as you kind of put it, it's all over. The sun in that scenario, if you're visualizing it, is the why behind it all.
It's no different, Will. Sort of parting shot for me is it's no different to all of the great behavioral sales skills, and in my case, the ability skills that I provide clients and the other sales trainers provide their clients. It's what are the steps that I must take to become prolific at my sales job? All I would suggest to you is I think you can improve those if you're willing to accept that you've got this thing up here, which at the moment, in most cases, perhaps we're not utilizing to the best of our advantage. If we're not careful, to some extent, it can go to default. Default tends to be to keep me safe. Keep me safe stops me from doing stupid things, which is great, but it also stops me from, going a little bit out of the comfort zone. Yeah, it stops me from trying stuff. I genuinely believe, and you and I are living proof, that everybody's got latent potential. Okay? Now, whether you want to uncover it or not is irrelevant. The point I'm saying is I believe everybody could do more if they want to. Our job as sales leaders and the people that look after the wonderful salespeople that listen to this podcast is to give people the opportunity where they can discover this latent potential they've got and give them the chance to go and do something with it. Because whether you start a podcast or you write a book or you go and smash your targets, you could smash your targets even further if you give them the chance. And I just know that, I prove it to myself every single day. If I use this a little bit more and I put it together with the process and the skill set that I've learned for myself, I think I'm a better salesperson.
Love it. I love it. Well, I'd love to have you come back on in the future, Matt, because I feel there's a conversation here of, I find I hold myself back and do stupid stuff as well as I do the good stuff. And so I end up in equilibrium. So even though I'm not necessarily just, sat on my ass doing nothing, I do stuff to self-sabotage myself, and I go up and up and up and down.
We're all self-sabotaging for sure, yeah? And again, if there's a chance to come back, we should talk about things like self-belief. How do we improve it? How do we increase it? Things like accountability. It's a massive problem for me as a trainer. How do I keep my client accountable so that they do what I share with them? Because, part of the problem is you share knowledge, and then you're kind of leaving it up to the client to make sure they input it. If you can create personal accountability, just imagine where you could go with that.
Yeah, and this is something that I struggle with, and so we'll have you back on. I've really enjoyed the conversation, Matt. I've got one final question to ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
The one piece of advice will be simply to be more ruthless with your time. They say the average age of the European adult, male and female combined, is just over 80 years. That's 80 laps of the sun. Yeah. I don't want to bring it down to the end of this show because I've really loved my time on the podcast, Will, and I'm really grateful that you got me involved. But I'm 50 years old, so I've already had my 50 laps. I've got 30 left. And if you think about it, time is the one thing that we've all got exactly the same amount of, yet we all decide to spend it in slightly different ways. So my advice to a younger person, myself, would be start getting really ruthless with your time. And the way to do that is to measure your time. Spend it on stuff that's good for you, whether that's financial, whether that's emotional, whether it's time with other people. As long as it's something that comes back to you, that's where you should spend your time rather than just wishing it away.
Well, look, two things, because it's not really a downer. One, you don't look 50, so you're doing something right on that front. Number two, you're a dude. I'm a dude. I can't speak for the women in the audience, but most dudes are complete idiots until they're kind of 25, 30 anyway. So even taking that kind of, and clearly we're going to live to more than 80 unless we get run over by a bus as medicine and all the technology side of it kind of progresses over our lifetimes. We should easily live to 100 odd. But everything that you've experienced so far, minus the, I don't know, I'm speaking for myself here, as well as every other bloke listening to this who's over the age of 25. If you get rid of that 0 to 25 time, well, you've only had one career. You've got time for a whole nother career, right? Before you pot your clogs. That should be empowering. If you're 50, you've got another 30 years of potentially solid work in you to do something incredible. I just wanted to kind of double down on that because that's something I think about. This is why I love business and sales, more so than kind of sports or anything like that, because they're all fleeting, they're all athletic. Maybe the Liverpool Football Club will have bionic fellas running around at some point, and that'll change the game, and people will be 50 and still running around and playing for the team. But until that point happens, business is the only sport, sales is the only sport, right? Where you can go until you're 80. I'm sure there's some, in fact, if anyone is over the age, listening to this now, you're in a B2B sales role and you're over the age of 75, email me because I want to speak to you. And with that, Matt, because I appreciate we've gone over kind of time here and I'm conscious of your diary of mine as well, mate. Tell us where we can find out more about you and tell us a little bit about the book as well.
Yeah, so the book is called Sales Glue. It's a book which is 50% is performance psychology based. So everything that we've shared with the listener on the show, you're going to find in this book. The other 50% is good old fashioned quality sales skill. And there's a lot of stuff in there from some of the really good quality sales trainers out there. A bit like Jeffrey Gittimer, who you had on your show the other week. So if you've been in sales for 5 years, this book's going to work for you. It's going to show you how you can link mindset and skill together. So that would be the first thing. You can go to Amazon. It's on Audible. So if you drive around for a living, like most of you guys I'm sure do, and girls do, then go and get the Audible version. If you haven't got Audible, then the good news is you can start a free account and get the book for nothing. My training company is called Salescadence, www.salescadence.co.uk/. I'm going to say / because I'd like to put a little exercise on for the listener. So if they go there / the Salesman Podcast, what I'll leave on there is what I call a sales audit. So I believe there are 15 things that the modern day sales professional should be very, very good at. And it'll explain when you get the exercise. But if you download the exercise, it allows you to score yourself where you are right now. And a little bit like we talked about a few minutes ago, Will, you can start to design what your future would look like. So I'll leave that exercise for them over there. They can go and grab that.
Perfect. And I will link to this episode over at salesman.org as well in the show notes, everything that we talked about in this episode, rather. And with that, Matt, I genuinely really enjoyed chatting with you personally in general, but this topic fascinates me. And I feel like I suss out one part of it and then there's 15 layers deeper to go down. So we'll have you back on in the future to give a kind of part 2 to this episode. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you, Will. It's been an absolute pleasure.